And welcome to this week's issue of the Dr. Tech Show, where myself and Sweyn Hunter will guide you through the world of online communications. This program, Dr. Tech Show, is the brainchild of John Popham, who unfortunately can't be with us today, but we send our best wishes, and we are joined by two very special guests, Chris Ashworth from Nominet and Ross McCulloch from Third Sector Lab, who are going to be talking to us about Reboot, a new interactive platform which helps communities reduce the digital divide between the connected and the unconnected. But in the usual fashion, we start with how's the weather where you are? So, Sweyn, how's the weather where you are today?
Well, each week that passes, it becomes more autumnal. It's hard to say precisely what it's going to do next.
There we go. And Chris, where are you and how's the weather where you are?
I am just south of Oxford, Pauline, and the sun is shining beautifully.
Excellent. Ross, how are things with you?
I mean, I'm in Scotland, that's all you need to know, really. I'm just outside Glasgow and it's very grey and overcast and it will rain shortly.
Okay.
But just a little bit quiet, Ross, if you can just either project or turn yourself up. One or the other.
2 seconds, let me try.
That's it.
Is that better or worse?
Much better. Yeah.
Better. What I also do is
What we're going to get.
pause the dishwasher as well, 2 seconds.
Always a good idea.
Level.
Okay, and in the west of Ireland, we are, well, I think it's going to be, when this program goes out, it's going to be sunny, you know, it's a bit grey and stuff now, but it's white, I can see clouds, so yeah, we'll just hope for the best. So for today, we are looking at celebrating Black History Month, which starts in October, obviously, and runs the whole of the month, and up and down the country and around the world. I think in other places as well. Black history is being celebrated, and we'd love to hear your stories of digital inclusion and Black History Month, whatever stories come up about that. And also on the 1st of October is International Day of Old Persons. Perhaps older persons is a better way of putting it. And the year 2020 marks the 75th anniversary of the United Nations and the 30th anniversary of the International Day of Older Persons. And this year has seen an emergence of COVID-19, obviously, that's caused upheaval across the world. And considering the higher risks confronted by older persons during the outbreaks of pandemics, just such as the COVID, policy and programmatic interventions must be targeted towards raising awareness of the particular needs of older people, recognizing their contributions to their own health and the multiple roles they play in the preparedness and response phases of current and future pandemics is also important. So we are glad to be celebrating that, and are going to go straight into welcoming our guests and talking about the project that they're working on. So welcome again, Chris and Ross. And I think first of all, we'd like to just get some background of the two of you, where your feet are in the field of digital inclusion, and then we'll talk more about the Reboot project. So Chris, would you like to start?
Yeah, thank you. I'm not sure my feet are anywhere. I'm usually knee deep in digital inclusion work. For me, it started, I began with Nominet Trust in 2016, working on digital skills and inclusion programs for disadvantaged young people, so people who are not in education, employment, and training, and trying to bring a bit of a user-centered approach to the corporate style initiatives that seem to have sprung up at that time and still do exist. And so I've been continuing in that community of practice since then. Co-founding the Digital Access for All initiative and working on a number of programs. So my job is to kind of design programs and, thankfully, after fundraising, spend money and put it into initiatives, measure the impact of various sort of like action-orientated pilots and look to scale across the UK. So I'm pretty obsessed around digital inclusion and digital skills, and it got quite the airtime this year with the pandemic. So we've been doubling our efforts and enjoying the wake-up call almost that the rest of the UK's had, that it's quite an important topic, isn't it? So.
No longer the future, as people still seem to say in some conversations. Oh, digital, that's the future. Maybe not so much, you know. Yeah. And so Ross, you've also got a long history in this field. Can you give us a bit of a flavour of where you got started from and what you've been doing up to now?
Yeah, so I mean, I've been working in charity digital for over 10 years, and I guess one of the big things that I've been speaking to people during that period is trying to not make assumptions about their users and how they live their lives and where digital fits in their lives. So, yeah, although I've never worked specifically on a digital inclusion project, I think it's been a core part of any of the kind of strategy work that we've been doing with charities is really helping them understand how people are living their lives and the types of devices they're using and the way in which they're doing it. I think that it was actually a big shock for a lot of people when COVID hit, is like they just didn't deliver any digital services because they made really ill-conceived, like preconceived kind of notions of how people were using digital in their day-to-day lives or what their skill set was. And actually, when they came to roll some of the stuff out, we're really surprised. But also, it's unearthed some of the real issues that, you know, if someone's got really poor access to data and everything that I want to access you've decided is going to be on Zoom, that's going to prove some real big problems for me in the tiny data package that I'm on, or the pay-as-you-go package I'm on. So I think it's kind of all those kind of nuances of that conversation around digital inclusion, whether it's about like the devices, the data, or their skills, it's brought that to the forefront in a way it just wasn't before at all. Yeah, so it's kind of, it's a weird situation where COVID's awful, but at the same time, it's completely elevated people's understanding of digital inclusion.
Definitely. And you've been spectacularly busy, I would say. I mean, you know, I've been on some of the calls that you've run as part of DigiShift, and you know, you were already trying to work with people towards, you know, towards digital inclusion for everybody. But you've certainly had to and have done raised your game immensely. You know, you've affected the whole of the country, I would say. I would think any charity that wants to do digital in this country will have heard of you by now, and hopefully will have been on one of the calls.
Yeah, it's been a bit crazy. It's weird, like you take like a decade to try and convince people of something, then like overnight they're like, yeah, that thing you've been saying for a decade. And you're like, yeah.
I know where you're coming from on that one, Ross. I mean, I take the point about Zoom and data packages and so on, but trying to persuade people over the last 5, 10, 15, even 20 years to try and do a bit of video meeting, you know, just sometimes. And now suddenly we're all on Zoom or Teams or something like 9 hours a day. It's quite weird, as you say.
Yeah, including festivals and events. I mean, Sweyn has been particularly involved in a couple of local festivals, the Orkney Science Festival for one, and the How the Light Gets In, I think, as well, you're talking about.
Well, I was a customer for the How the Light Gets In. That's a much bigger operation than the Orkney festivals. But yeah, I mean, I mean, you've given me pause for thought, as I'll say again, Ross, about the cost of Zoom and data and so on. But if that can be got around, I think there is a solid accessibility argument now in terms of reasonable adjustments for as we go back to having in-person events and training and so on. You know, what is your defense against my suggestion that making your event accessible using live streaming or Zoom or whatever? What's your defense against that? Why is that not a reasonable adjustment? And if that one isn't, then what are you going to do? And I would address that to all events now. And it could be that it's an unreasonable imposition on some community groups to expect them, given their scale, to do this sort of thing. But you don't have to be a very big organisation for this to be relatively straightforward and very cheap.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. And I think as well, what we've seen a lot of charities being really flexible, and I think actually a lot of funders deserve a lot of credit during this period, where, you know, we've seen people where they might have spent quite a lot of money on staff expenses with travel, and they've not got that expense now, and they're able to use that budget to give people pay-as-you-go data plans. And so I think charities have been really clever and shifted really quickly to prioritise money and to help the beneficiaries. Like some of the stuff's just been amazing, to be honest.
I can't wait to see the GrantNav, you know, open data platform of what funders are funding. in 6 months' time or even sooner maybe, and see the kind of things that have been funded. I mean, I know I asked one of the funders in the Midlands about this a couple of months ago to say, you know, who are people applying for specific digital projects? And she said it's too early to tell, but I think they're starting to come through now, and people are recognizing that. And but not just the kit, obviously, which we'll talk about with your Reboot project, but also the skills, you know, the hand holding, the guidance. It's because it's not just all about the kit, is it? It's what people want to get to on the other side of it that's really important. So that leads us neatly on, I think, to talking about this project, and we'd love to hear from either or both of you about how it started and you know, what you're hoping for from it.
Yeah, I mean, it's Chris's baby, so I'll let Chris do
Shall I
that.
jump in?
I'm going to bring up your website, and maybe you can talk to that. Would that
Go
help?
for it. Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah. Yeah, so it started actually. So the kind of digital inclusion kind of like I said before, sort of community of practice. We were asked by DCMS in March-ish to see if we could stand up a campaign called Device.now. So it was kind of chaired by the Future a digital skills program. If we could stand up an emergency campaign for COVID to get devices and connectivity and support into households that didn't have it. So that's been myself and a group of others on kind of emergency response mode from March, and that followed just after. I don't know if you'd seen, but we'd lobbied the telcos, the four main telcos, to zero rate essential services. So that means that the NHS estate was free to access for anybody who didn't have credit or data. And we were a bit worried about disrupting some of the rules around net neutrality, but that created a little bit, I think, of a sea change in people's appreciation that a device and connectivity were going to be part of the toolkit to help flatten the curve. I can't believe that we're still talking about curves and stuff, but that seems like a phrase from the archives now. But so Device.now happened, and throughout that, my role was to sort of design the overall program, the blueprint, from a user design perspective, and make sure that works. But you're in emergency mode, so what we were essentially doing was asking the big tech companies or a few organisations if they could supply a significant amount of devices and connectivity or philanthropy to meet the need of the 1.9 million households who didn't have a device and connectivity. And I think from the get-go, I felt like, even though this was the right thing to do in an emergency, we were dealing with an inherent slight contradiction in something that had been niggling at me for quite a few years, which is there are 40 million devices out there in the UK, probably meters from where they're needed. And if you, I don't know where you're all sat exactly at the moment, but if you look around the room that you're sat in now, if you look at, you know, what's the most expensive thing in this room, and you might look around and you'll look to your laptop, you'll look to your smartphone, and then you look around the room and say, what can I donate to charity? What can I give to my community? It's kind of everything but those items. So this kind of new industry that we've got of hardware and powerful devices, it hasn't grown up in the same way that we have done with, you know, I'm a big fan of Oxfam because it's, you know, been there, I worked there for a long time. But everything, when you work at Oxfam, everything you look around and see is capable of being reused and recycled and upcycled and donated. So I found it sort of slightly odd working in the tech for good space and digital inclusion space that we've got these really valuable devices, and it's really, really difficult. But the norm is not to help other people who do need them by giving them away. So Reboot was born out of this principle that demand exceeded supply for Devices.now, and there were a quarter of a million people who were shielding who didn't have a device and connectivity at least. And no matter how much money we got given or how successful we were in that appeal, we couldn't buy. There weren't that many new devices available at the time. They were all either stuck in China or in storerooms in Rotterdam. And I never want us to sort of face that situation again. So when we're talking about refreshing our approach to digital inclusion and digital access, when I was trying to think through what can we do where we'll never face that problem again, where supply will exceed demand. And the only way to do that is to reboot existing devices. And then we started digging deeper, and we did a big in-depth discovery research into the process, the ramifications, the choices that get made along that journey of rebooting a existing device and putting it into the hands of somebody who needs it. So we learned lots from device.now, but what we also learned was that some surprising new developments in the world of tech hardware, that actually if you've got a computer that's 10 years old, you can reboot that and turn it into a Chromebook. I feel often like I'm a Google Chromebook advertising agent. I should be on some sort of commission, but it's actually easier now to restore a device than it was a few years ago. And I've tried this as an experiment. I've got a 2013-year-old Windows laptop. I've turned it into a Chromebook, and it's faster and better than the recent Chromebooks I bought. We've got hundreds of thousands of school children who are, self-isolating, or their bubbles have burst. We've got, as you mentioned, then loads and loads of charities and hyperlocal organisations who have got now more limited relationships with their service users. We've got people in the community who are more lonely and more isolated than they were before. And it breaks my heart when I get messages from charities even in the Oxfordshire area saying, we've got some really, really vulnerable service users with acute issues and problems, and we don't have the basics of the devices and the connectivity in place. We know what we're doing, as Ross said before, we know what we're doing once we've got the relationship in place. We know how to engage with them. We know we have to keep those relationships open because they can be volatile. We simply don't have those basics. It's kind of like, it's no good teaching calligraphy if you've not got the pen and the ink in the first place. It sounds really basic as a structural intervention for in the world of tech for good and digital inclusion, but it's simply a case of there is a lot of stuff out there. We need to get it into the hands of the people who need it, and there's a way of doing that, and that isn't a top-down national gifting of hundreds of millions of pounds being spent on brand spanking new laptops, where the majority of that cash will go into the supply chain. So Reboot is a free resource, and it's about putting the power into the hands of the local community. And actually, the most important thing is all it is a reflection of what already happened during the pandemic, which was not recorded by charities, not recorded by national actors, but happened in people's local communities, on the street, between families, between friends, between neighbours, which is the transfer of devices and connectivity and support from one person to the next. So all it does is collecting that information and then giving people a cookie cutter guide, and a personalised, customised guide to how they can do that themselves. So if you're a school leader, if you're a charity network leader, if you're a collection of local organisations who see and sense this problem, as we heard all the way through COVID, here is a way you can do it without having to start from scratch and without having to learn every stage yourself. I've realised I've done a massive monologue about it there, and didn't take you through some of the basics on the homepage, but I can do that now if you want.
Well, I think it's a good overview, and one we were hoping to have, because I think often we don't get to hear about the background of projects and kind of where they came about. But obviously, then I'm interested to hear from Ross about how they became involved, and or his organisation became involved, and what his perspective is on it as well. So Ross, do you want to leap in there?
Yep, sure. Yeah, I mean, I think so. Prior to being involved in Reboot, the Third Sector Lab did the website build, and we helped with, I guess, a lot of the thinking behind it. So I'd been involved with a thing called Connecting Scotland, and so this was an initiative from the Scottish Government. So Cat Macaulay, who's their lead service designer at Scottish Government, basically brought together a group of people at the early stage to say, we know this is an issue and everything that Chris has described, where there's people being left behind who can't access vital public services, and what we're going to do about it. And so they've now, that programme's now supported 50, I think it's 50,000 households that's now at. It's, so the latest round of investment into that's now £43 million that's gone in. So my role was kind of very early on at the kind of outset of helping develop what that would look like and think about the logistics of it and some of the sticking points. And so it's now SCVO administers that programme, and it's basically what Chris has described, which is getting devices to people. They have specifically a 12-month data package that they give to people under the households, and then importantly basic digital skills and helping people think about, why do you want to get online, what do you want to get out of this. So that, I guess, was probably the thing that I came to Reboot. That was kind of my background at the start of COVID around this. But I think, like Chris's point, that there's just so many devices sitting in households, and actually the danger is sometimes you need new devices, particularly want to get stuff out quickly, but actually we're sitting on a goldmine of devices in the house, using something like, like Neverware to go and put Chrome operating system on an old IBM laptop. There's probably, like, every local authority probably has literally thousands of these things sitting in cupboards that are running an old version of Windows, or one thing doesn't quite work as it's meant on them, and actually they could be repurposed into a really powerful device that could be used by households and people in schools. And actually there's something really amazing there. And so I think that's, for me, where it's really exciting. And basically, I mean, what the site does, as Chris described, is you put in your criteria at every step, and it will spit out a set of recommendations onto what your programme is going to look like. And that's pretty much it in a nutshell. We kind of built the site very, very rapidly, and I think we're now at a stage where we're trying to get user feedback and get some insight from it to think about what changes we need to make in a kind of version 1.1 of the site. But yeah, it's been, I mean, like, it's been used by small digital inclusion groups. I think it was like Rory at Govan Housing Association was talking about using it recently. But yeah, I think for a lot of people, it's like they just don't know where to start, and this gives them that blueprint.
I think that's a very common thing to say, and like it reminds me of I don't know if you know, the Engine Room did a thing called Aldate, where they, you're able to put your specification into what your requirements into Aldate as a tool, and it would give you a specification at the end if you for any technical project that you needed. So it sounds like this is a similar sort of thing, and exactly, people think they know where to start these things and what they need, and they don't. So asking the right questions is such a key part of projects like this, and it's great to have that and freely available. But I know, I can see from the drop down of kind of where people are active so far. You've got London, Yorkshire, and the Southwest. So were they kind of three early pilot areas, or how did they get involved?
We've had a number of, there's a number of organisations that sort of appeared during Device.now that were sort of pioneering this. Reboot is almost a reflection of people like Power to Connect in Wandsworth, who've done an amazing job. I think today they announced the 300th iPad that they've repurposed. Thrive in Oxford, the University of Salford. So there's been what's been interesting is it's been sort of like all creatures great and small. There's been really hyper local, small social enterprises who've kind of sprung together. There's been local authorities. There was an initiative in Birmingham. A lot of them are time bound. There's been a collection of libraries in Cambridgeshire. There's been all the groups that have been involved in Connecting Scotland as well, where you've got, like I said, organisations that are very, very localised. You've got local authorities across a bigger area. We're speaking with the Oxfordshire Community Foundation group of around 30 organisations. I'm hoping one of the reasons why Ross and I really pushed the development, and it was a real kind of all hands on deck for a good few weeks, was a bit like a lot of the initiatives with coronavirus that were successful, like the mutual aid groups, is they were leaning on their anticipatory skills, I think, quite substantially, which is, can we get Reboot at least, you know, an MVP, get some of the snags out of the way before schools get back in September.
Right.
Because we're very comfortable talking to the charity sector, and particularly the early adopters in the charity sector, you know, the people who work with CAST and Catalyst and that collective that we're all part of. And whilst they work in EdTech to a degree, how do you get a teacher inspired by something like Reboot if you've not got strong established real networks in place over many years there? So we know that we've got to take teachers and school leaders on a bit of a journey. So we wanted to get that site up and ready, and at least a resource to be had. If you go through those criteria that Ross mentioned and you say, I'm a school or we're a group of schools, we've got a bit of an IT budget, and we need to connect the 30 to 40% of children in the bubble that's just burst, which is exactly what's just happened in my household. So we're lucky. We're one of the 70 that do have a device and connectivity. I'd be pretty surprised if I'm advocating tech for good and didn't have devices in the house. But I know there are families in the local area, even in somewhere as, you know, sunny and middle class as Oxfordshire. There are plenty of people out there now who are getting left behind again because of lockdown. And you know, and with the best will in the world, there won't be a national initiative unless you're lucky enough to be in Scotland, where the Scottish government are doing everything right. I've said a few.
I think that's an interesting point. I mean, in some ways, Scotland, the number of organisations in Scotland as a whole is probably order of magnitude fewer than the number of organisations in England, even without Wales. And I think quite often parallels are drawn between things that happen in Scotland as a whole and things that happen in areas like London as a whole, or things that happen in, you know, East Anglia as a whole, rather than things that happen across England absolutely uniformly. But I was going to say, I mean, I'm aware locally that the Orkney Disability Forum has plugged itself into the Connecting Scotland project, and I was quite interested because what they've chosen to do is they've chosen to get 4 new iPads for 4 of their clients typically with mobility problems, whether that's temporary while waiting for surgery or, you know, chronic conditions. And I just crossed my mind, was that really the right device to buy? I mean, I'm not criticizing Orkney Disability Forum in any way whatsoever, but when I saw your project, Chris, I'm really glad to hear that it's been plugged into Connecting Scotland, because it's bound to make the funding go a lot further than
and it's a choice as well. I think that the option to buy new, I think if an organisation has got the funding in place, and particularly if the users have got very specific, you know, accessibility needs, I think is probably a good shout. I remember with the Home Access Scheme back in 2008, one of the 2 areas that the scheme, which was incredibly successful, failed on the most, was English as a second language and supporting people with disabilities. So I think there's definitely a case of when you lay out your own blueprint, and what we try to do is make that as easy as possible for any group, you know, with little or no experience, that you can go, do you know what, actually we've got a certain budget and it's best spent there. But exactly to that point as well, people have then got the choice to say, this is the total cost per user, which is as simple as we break it down. This is the cost per beneficiary number. If people wanted a rough guide for that, I'd say it was about £500, maybe a little less if you're lucky. But that's, you know, that's your Chromebook, that's 2 years worth of connectivity, and then that's the cost of support and administration, and it's of that figure. And it sounds rather kind of like, crude just to talk 500 quid per user. But the magnitude of difference that could be made if that collapses to £200 a user. And again, we're talking crudely about the number of people you can reach and support. And I think it's so important. Sometimes we can get lost in the kind of the magic and interest of tech for good and the power of the devices and the productivity of the different apps and things. But we're talking about a large population of the UK, which, and there's no studies being done, there's 1.9 million people without device and connectivity. No one's done any research yet to say, how has that increased or decreased during coronavirus? Yet we know that a typical household with kids, the number of devices required per household has now suddenly quadrupled during the day. So is that 1.9 million a lot bigger? And then we've got the massive issue of data poverty. And I think if there's one nut that we've not been able to crack yet, it's been how do we complement something like Reboot and the ability to collapse the cost with the issue of data insecurity and data poverty, which is still yet to have a concerted solution. We've got ideas and we've got a big report coming out soon, but that to me is where I'd rather people, took Reboot, took Connecting Scotland and went, do you know what? We can do the hardware, the device. It's a capital one-off thing. It's an object. We can see it. We know there's one there, and we know it needs to go there. Let's just bloody get on with it. The connectivity piece, the personal data piece, that necessity to solve that is still the biggest outstanding issue.
I think that the thing that I admire most about the Connecting Scotland programme is the concept of the digital champions that are being trained, and the way that that's managing to embed into civic society, basically, a capacity to support people. Maybe it's going to be supporting them to find affordable data for them, or maybe it's going to be, but so many projects seem to be all about the flashy, shiny things that get dumped on people from the planet Zanussi, almost, it seems, if you remember the old adverts. But the Scottish scheme and also the Welsh scheme seem to be firmly rooted in proper support to the people that are being provided with the technology. And I think it's been such a gap for so long that it's really good to see that sort of project take that really seriously. And I think the method of embedding digital champions within organizations that are already working in various different sectors and spheres, I think it's a really good way of making the most of making more of an impact, much more of an impact than simply buying devices and handing them out.
Yeah.
The issue of data poverty is, again, one we've discussed on this program before. In fact, last week's show we had a story about Citizen SIM, which is where people who have extra data can gift it to other organizations. I'm sure it's probably covered in your report, Chris. But it is one that we are concerned about, and we know that there's loads of data out there not being used that people would be willing to give to other people who need it for whatever reason.
There's a giga mountain out there at the end of every month that just vanishes back to the telcos, and
it's not right.
Crazy. So I have
to say there's a certain element of that the market assumes that will happen. I mean, I think if everybody started using every last megabyte of their data, probably the networks would just collapse. So there is an element of marketing of huge amounts of data that nobody's ever going to use, but there's got to be scope for I don't know. We were talking about seeing data as more of a utility than a kind of discretionary spend.
Yeah. But there are precedents for the scheme. There's a scheme in Australia, Optus. There's a scheme, I think, in the Netherlands, where you're right, it's baked into the business plans. But I think that also
at the margin, it should be possible to do something.
Yeah, and also you'll only get a certain percentage of consumers who might take up the offer, and that's okay. So it's kind of, we probably only need to tap into carve away and quarry 5% of that data mountain, or is it data for fishing the data pool or whatever it might be. But there's certainly a way of carving out a little bit. And I think that for me, when we come to hopefully champion the idea a little more. Or when I say we, who that we is, I don't know yet. But there's a first mover advantage to the one of those 4 brands doing it and doing it well.
Well, I mean, EE at least already has this family sharing of data built into their systems, so you would think it wouldn't take a tremendous amount of effort to generalize that a bit.
No, and I'm busy registering.
Even their own...
I'm registering all students as my extended family. Okay, now, so it's just the paperwork's taken a while, but yeah, currently I've got 47,000 family members in the south of England.
Yeah, I've got a friend who, when she realised that I was working on a mobile hotspot since I've been in Ireland for the last, when I was isolating for 2 weeks so I could see my mum at the end of 2 weeks, and working in a mobile hotspot and using a gig of data every time I wanted to do an hour-long Zoom call. She wanted to gift some of her data to me, but she wasn't able to because we're not on the same account. But, so there are people out there, just friends and family, who are starting to get their heads around this, which is great. And it'd be good to see more of that. Ross, what would you say you've kind of learned, you've known already, and that you specifically brought to a project like this with your experience?
God, what I learned, I guess there's so much. I mean, I think that way that Reboot talks about it, and the same way that Connecting Scotland talks about it, about talking about devices, data and skills, and none of those things sit in isolation, I think is really important. I think we just need to keep having that home. And I think, like Chris's point, that there'll be a mix. So organisations that I'm speaking to have been doing stuff before Connecting Scotland came along, and Connecting Scotland's helping plug a gap, but they'll also be tapping into Reboot because they've applied to Connecting Scotland, and it can only work with so many other users, but they'll be able to go and source a bunch of devices because our company down the road is offloading a load of laptops that staff don't use anymore. And so almost every charity that I'm speaking to, there's some kind of jigsaw of what this looks like. It's not as if like one hand's going, everything's a new device. There'll always be a mix of things going on, and that's totally okay. Because you might have someone who's got really specific accessibility needs and someone else who's really comfortable using a Chromebook. And so I think that we've seen organisations flex. What I think is really interesting though is most organisations doing this are not traditionally tech charities or social enterprises. It's like people like Food Train in Scotland or like Peak, so like youth work organisations or food delivery charities, where they're the people having a connection in communities face to face with people. They've got a connection that a lot of the tech charities just don't have. And so I think that's what's really interesting, is a lot of charities repurposing themselves to kind of tackle the digital divide in a way that wasn't being done at scale before. And
you would hope that the tech charities would also flex slightly and start to support those other charities rather than trying to support people directly. As things go on, and as Connecting Scotland either flourishes into a permanent expenditure item in the Scottish Government's budget or closes, you will, even if it does close, let's hope it doesn't, there'll still be this network of digital champions everywhere that could be then further supported into the next generation of stuff, whatever that's going to be, by the more technically minded, more technically focused charities, rather than them trying to interact with 100 million individuals. I think the beauty of both the Scottish and the Welsh scheme is just this. It's well designed. I mean, it's not surprising that a service designer has been behind some of it. It's well designed, and it's really good to see.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, and I think it'll be interesting. So I think it'll be interesting aspirationally what's happening. What we're seeing is more and more projects where it's not just at a basic digital skills level, but being quite aspirational for that end user. So like from the Scottish Government's point of view, this is good because it's meeting like some of their targets around digital inclusion, but also it means that like as you get that aspiration of a digitally inclusive society, people can access public services. You've now got people who weren't able to do that before can now access public services digitally, so that's amazing. But like at a really small level, so like charities like the YMCA in Paisley, like they've been doing amazing stuff. So they've been going out and basically like taking Raspberry Pis and literally like hand delivering them to young people's houses. And they've been running like online coding clubs. So they go with a Raspberry Pi and like the keyboard and all the other bits that people need to deliver them like a package. and then they're running a coding club online for kids who don't have a device in the house. And so for me, there's almost a bit, it's like part of it's the kind of very basic fundamentals of, do you have a device, can you get online, do you have basic digital skills, but it's like, how do we use that to be really aspirational about some of the people we're working with?
It can only be a matter of time. It can only be a matter of time before somebody invents a maturity model for this.
Yeah.
Well, really, yeah. But there is the really important point around it is that it's mainstreaming. The people from any digital inclusion or digital access program that we've ever funded or worked on, the most critical element, which is no different to any other scheme that gets worked on, is the relationship between the service user and the charity, the youth worker, the social worker, the teacher, the community worker. That relationship of trust, and so what we've seen over the last 6 months is this blended approach to that relationship that maybe wasn't there before. With hearing lots of stories around where somebody would be going to a community group, it'd be their one chance to socialise in the week, and they've been forced into this situation where they've got a blended model, and they've not got all the terms for it. They're not using all the language of the digital access and inclusion community would normally do, but they are now doing it, and they're doing it because of the pressure of the pandemic. But that's now spread everywhere. So a food bank might have a blended model of engagement with their users in their local area. And what I think has been really interesting is to Ross's point, there is a chance that we're never going to solve completely, we're never going to have 100% digital inclusion because of various different factors. But what this does is frees up resources for those people who would otherwise receive a poorer or less frequent service as well. So there's a dual benefit, I think, if we get that model right, but not seeing it nationally driven eventually, and not seeing it driven without users in mind, and not driven from trusted relationships, I think are all massive benefits that we're starting to see normalised now.
Yeah. User research has been a key thing that we've talked about on this program before, and for example, some of the devices that we've looked at to help people get online. One I think was the Comp is a set-top box to allow people to do video calls with their families and friends, and they discovered that in research they have a little remote that's used to turn the machine or to accept or not accept a call. And the buttons that they press on the device are either blue or green, and normally you'd expect green or red because yes or no. But in fact, they found in testing that users didn't like to press the red button. It was seen as a danger sign. It was unfriendly. It wasn't what they wanted. So they went for blue and green because people felt they could press the blue button to say no without upsetting somebody or without causing an international incident. So user research has been, is obviously one of the watchwords. And the other thing, as you've both said as well, is that digital it's not about digital being the be all and end all. It's about opportunities. And for people who don't want to go online, there should still be services that they can use access, without having to go online. So I'm sure you've borne that in mind. I was wondering about any other projects you've looked at that are similar, or is this kind of would you say unique in this country or in around the world? There must be other people thinking about this anyway.
I suppose Pauline, it's based in principle, as Ross will know, with the work with I'm working at the moment with Sarah over at Snook, Sarah Drummond and the Snook gang, along with Bernardo's and Public Policy Lab on the design patterns for mental health. So I suppose when Ross and I were first talking about it, it had that pattern library principle in place. I suppose it falls onto that fundamentals of we're trying to give information out that means that people aren't learning independently from scratch to develop their own approach too. So with design patterns for mental health, that's about saying if you are a smaller organisation who's got more limited resources, but you need and want to create a digital mental health service for your organisation and for your users, then here are the things that everybody else has learned packaged up neatly for you, so that you're through the first 400 discovery stages. So it's definitely got that feel about it. At its core, it's a reflection of everything we've seen and heard throughout digital inclusion, laced with the expertise of organisations like Good Things Foundation and the Online Centres Network, who've been working on this for over a decade. So it is it's meant to be a playback of what we saw. It's meant to be a town square for people to collaborate on, and it's meant to provide you with a blueprint of a scheme that may work, but enough space for you to go, actually, in my local community, we've got an organisation, a research organisation that so far has binned all its laptops because it's a bit worried about sensitivity. There's 200 a month coming out of that place, so let's throw them in. So it's kind of meant to be there to create, like I say, the purpose of a blueprint or a wireframe is for then people to put their own details and overlay them. It's not meant to give you so much that it's rigid.
Yeah.
Going back to what you said about being focused by the requirements of the pandemic. I mean, emergency planners, I work for a local authority, so we have emergency plans. They one of the things that they always say, they don't say it very loudly, and they try not to be misunderstood as they do say it, but they say, never let a crisis go to waste. And there are several things about the COVID thing in terms of digital and inclusion that really, despite the fact that it's an awful situation, we wouldn't have chosen to be in it, we might as well make best use of the features of the lockdown to make progress, as just exactly as you said. On a personal point of view, I mean, being able to be involved in projects like this from Orkney is amazing, and would not really probably happen. Well, it possibly would have with John Popham, because he's special. He's like the trailblazer of all accessibility and live streaming activity ever in the universe, as far as I'm concerned, for community use anyway. But the opportunities of people, either Scottish Islanders or people who are digitally excluded or people who have disabilities of various forms, opportunities that the pandemic are giving are enormous compared to normal steady state stuff.
I think we've had a lot of conversations about this, about if you're, I mean, I'm a massive fan of systems thinking. If someone can design the systems map to the consequences of the pandemic in the positive, so does it have, the whole point of digital inclusion work is to address social inequality in the long term, outside of an emergency, flatten the curve. The point of Device.now was to stop people who were told to shield from going into the pharmacy or the food store or the GP surgery because they were the petri dishes of the virus. So there was a life-saving element to it. Now, when we're talking about the system of digital and social inclusion, because the two are so inextricably linked, what does this mean for opportunities in a digital career for a young person in rural Wales who is supporting as a carer for one of their parents? Can they become a games developer with Ubisoft? Yeah, they can, if the tools for them are out there, because the world of work has been reframed. So what does it, there's loads and loads of negatives we can look at, and absolutely they need addressing, because social mobility is still chronically misunderstood and chronically misdirected in terms of national policy. But there's certainly ways in which we can see, or I'm seeing different spins on how I would design and develop programs that affect social inclusion and social mobility.
I noticed
sorry, Pauline.
I was just saying, I noticed that one of the other big organisations that has been there for a long time has also been looking at repurposing. I'm sure that there are others repurposing devices. Is business in the community. They have a shopping list, if you like, of the various things that are needed. Have you been able to link up with networks like that? I know you've got some partners on your website, but it's just it's interesting to me who you're working with. Ross, maybe you have a view on that as well.
In terms of partners organisations?
And others who you can work with this, Yeah,
I mean, I've not, because I've never been involved in kind of procurement. I mean, the organisation that Connect in Scotland work with, I think it's XMA, but that's all new devices. But Crystal is a better oversight of kind of organisations at a national level that are doing stuff with refurbished devices.
Okay, Chris.
Well, business in the community, we helped in the first few weeks of COVID. We built the business response to COVID website for the ITC, so the National Business Network, which I think has matched about 2,000 charities with local businesses through the Responsible Business Network. So we're fortunate enough to work with Outlandish and Harry and we were there to build that. And then we've had business community feed into the Reboot project. We've helped them with about 6 or 7 schemes that they've been running with sort of regional businesses who wanted to do a refurbished scheme with their staff and their IT departments. And we've been lucky enough to be supported by Vodafone, who did the Great British Tech Appeal. So I suppose it's a case of waiting now to see who. We're out there. We've got a list of really, really great partners who've fed in. And as I said before, it's a resource where we want it to sit there, and rather than be controlling and directing, to say, you know, is there a national telco and a major partner, you know, Age UK and Vodafone or whoever it might be, they can simply use it, or they can simply use the resource, as could a local community group. It's kind of, there's no, it's in the pre-competitive space that we just want the
kind
end
of a movement
outcome.
as opposed to you're encouraging people to do something broadly similar along similar lines,
exactly,
using similar templates, but actually it's not restrictive in any way because
no,
it's
it's
not
not.
there.
Yeah, it's not proprietary. It's Creative Commons. It's you know change the name and completely copy the website as long as Ross lets them. You know, do whatever you feel is necessary and iterate, and there'll be new ideas, fresh ideas, better ideas that can build upon, and we'll change with the times. But it's an open source approach.
It's really exciting. It's in that it has that model. I can't think of many other technological or any other kind of practical stuff like that. I can't think of any other that are as comprehensive and yet as you can make them as individual or as specific as you need to.
I think that's possibly a legacy of the way in which the world of tech for good has emerged. That in the core community of practice, I think there's lots and lots of the reuse. And Ross, as Ross knows, you know, lots of the close community work together for the common good. I think if you look at kind of CSR budgets and some of the gargantuan size of some of the tech companies who do initiatives, they take a more proprietary approach to, this is the, I won't name any names because I'll have to work with them, but this is the X approach to AI for good, or this is our tech starter appeal. So there's less collaboration at that big tech level, which is where a lot of the money, you know, sits. And we're lucky as Nominet, we can escape that pressure of having to do that and then just go, what's the outcome focus.
You could make an argument as well that it's not just the big tech companies that behave like that. It's perhaps some larger, maybe specifically digital charities as well. There's a bit of competition there to do the same thing. It always seems to me. I'm a complete outsider. I work for a local authority. I'm not involved in these, but it's very clear sometimes that you see specific projects and you think, well, is that really working well with this other one? But this one, the beauty of this is that it's outward looking and inclusive rather than competitive and desperate to get a number.
Yeah. So do you have an idea of the kind of the ideal, you know, organization or group of organizations that you'd like to see working, you know, setting up a Reboot project?
Gosh, I mean, when we talk about 98% of young people in private schools had access to device connectivity, 1 in 5 for kids on pupil premium had access to a device during lockdown. To me, it would be that there's plenty of individual schools or school groups and academies that are in areas of multiple deprivation. I would love to be, you know, I think we said, Ross, didn't we, that there's 300 schemes across the UK at different levels, you know, in the next year. Then if it's doing its job well, then there'll be 300. If a school does it successfully in a community, then it might trigger another school doing it. I think what would be really good in the long term is that we normalise the concept of not putting devices into lofts or put them into the e-waste pile. I'd love to see a charity shop network make it normalise the fact that that's where you take your laptop in, and you know that the data will be securely wiped.
Yeah.
And find its way to a good home. That's the longer term.
Do you know, I think that like that point alone is like it's a huge stumbling block. So I think a lot of people don't want to give devices because they're scared like what can someone retrieve from this device, and sometimes they're right. And I think it needs like a trusted, almost like kind of kite mark of here's what we're going to do at your device. It's really safe, and there's like a consistent approach.
That's really important. That's really important.
That's really important. And then I think as a charity, if you're giving a device to people, you've then also got concerns as to like how secure is this device? Like, is it the latest operating system? Am I safeguarding the people that I'm giving the device to? So there's a bit in there as well. So I think we need to get those two bits right to get people really comfortable. I think Chris is right. It's like people keep phones because they're like, I might need a spare phone one day, and you've got like a £300 phone.
15 of them, yeah.
Like, every day.
Yeah.
Are you? Have you got any concerns about commercial organisations sort of jumping on this opportunity and sort of, not being tech for bad or something like that?
Do you know what? There's actually, I've always been very suspicious, but there's been some interesting conversations around the donation mechanism that we're hoping to see a bit of movement on, which is where for every 100 devices that might get donated to, let's say someone starts a scheme, you could monetize and sell the top 10%, which pays for the professional refurbishment and very high quality data safeguarding for the other 90%. So there's a circular economy that a number of people are talking about, which in a way, I'm not the kind of old school. It's like you take a device off somebody and then you hand it to the person who needs it, and you just do that. But actually, they're talking about a slightly more sophisticated approach. And if it's about the outcome, if it's about the fact people lose this misconception that a device isn't a commodity, it's the software that can work on these things nowadays, then let it compete with the donated scheme and see which one's most successful. And
I mean, you've seen that with charity shops who accept donations and then set up, sell the best stuff that they've got in order to put the money back into the charity, which may not have been what the donor envisaged, but it's about making best use of the equipment that you get. Yeah.
So I think that's what we want to see there is competing models, innovation, social entrepreneurs getting involved, as to Ross's point there about someone needs to change the system. Somebody might need to campaign on data poverty. An organisation really needs to get behind that.
Yeah.
Somebody might say there's a standards issue. What does the kite mark look like that isn't a long BSI number or BSO number or whatever, ISO, for data standards that the public can expect and understand, are there simple tools? I'd love to see Neverware and Eraser software can join together so there's a one single solution. So plugging your laptop in and wiping and updating it that is, open to the public to be able to do simply.
Lots of interesting futures.
Yes, we're going to have to, I think, draw things to a close. But if people want to get in touch, and I know you've got a Facebook page, what's the best way for people to take, who are listening to this or watching this show, what's the best step for them to take?
So jump onto the Reboot platform, so www.rebootproject.uk. There's a directory page and a community page and a contact us page there, so info@rebootproject.uk. And you'll have myself and some colleagues ready to help support you.
And Ross, any last words from you about your next steps with the project?
Yeah, I think we're still involved in kind of helping Chris think about like what needs to happen in terms of making it easier for people to kind of use this. But I think the main thing is this is about taking what works elsewhere and tweaking it to work in your local area. And I think that for me is the big thing that people need to kind of to get their head around is you're not starting with a blank slate. You're taking the thing that worked in school down the road and you're tweaking it because you work with more children that have got learning disabilities, therefore you need to think about X, Y, and Z. But you've taken that fundamental building block and you're building on top of that rather than you're starting from scratch every time you do something. And it's that, like that snowball effect that Chris mentioned. I think once you can get that to kick in local communities, you'll see more and more people starting to replicate each other's schemes and being able to roll it out really, really quickly.
Great. Well, thank you both very much for being on the Dr. Tech Show. Myself and Sweyn have been fascinated by this, and we're looking forward to discussing it more with John Popham when he's around to discuss it. And we wish you every success. And so if you're listening to this on Dr. Tech Show on YouTube or on Hope Radio in South Birmingham, we hope you've enjoyed the show, and we look forward to speaking to you again. If you want to contact the show, please email drtechshow@gmail.com. So thanks from me, Pauline and Sweyn. Thanks from you. Thank you very much. We'll just play it out.